Hey YouTubers, this is the Gold Standard Caesar 924 coming at you with Chapter 8 in my Wrestling Reimagining series for WWE in 2006. For today's video, I'll be covering the Smackdown July pay-per-view event known as the Great American Bash. This was a very weird show. There was a set of marquee matches that were scheduled to take place at the event that were altered at the very last moment due to circumstances beyond their control. One of those matches involved the match between Batista and Mark Henry, but during a six-man tag at Saturday night's main event, Mark Henry suffered I think it was like a knee injury of sorts, and he would be sidelined out of action for the rest of the year, which unfortunately Mark Henry was unable to compete at the Great American Bash, so they had Batista fight Mr. Kennedy instead. There was a triple threat match for the U.S. title with Finlay defending the belt against Bobby Lashley and William Regal. And this was a case of the notorious liver enzymes incident that happened. And Bobby Lashley was sidelined. Instead of being a triple threat match, this would end up being a one-on-one match with Finlay defending the belt against William Regal. There was the Pajumi prison match involving The Undertaker and the Great Khali, but like a similar incident with Bobby Lashley, Great Khali had to get pulled out of the match and was replaced with The Big Show. And the Cruiserweight title match between Gregory Helms and Super Crazy was replaced instead with Gregory Helms taking on Matt Hardy instead. Now, the Great American Bash, even rewatching it on the WWE Network, it's not as terrible as I thought it was going to be, but at the same time, you could really tell, even looking at the card, especially with the roster, with ECW coming back, it really played a big part in the diminished roster that the SmackDown roster had at this point. Randy Orton got drafted over the Raw. It wasn't drafted. There was no official draft except the ECW draft, but not like a traditional draft like Raw and SmackDown. There was just wrestlers that were just getting traded left and right out of nowhere. One of them being Randy Orton, who goes from SmackDown to Raw. Same went with Johnny Nitro and Melina. Kurt Angle, who was on SmackDown at the time, ended up going to ECW as well. There was just a bunch of trade-offs that were going on. I think that played a part in diminishing the SmackDown roster. The Great American Bash kind of summarizes the state of SmackDown as its initiative brand is concerned. I had a main event where Kurt Angle in my universe is the World Heavyweight Champion, but when I was researching of the wrestlers that were coming and going during that year, it turns out that Kurt Angle actually got suspended in July. And I don't know how long he was suspended. I would think it's about the same amount of days as Rob Van Dam, who was also suspended during that time due to getting caught with drugs. So they had to do a scenario in which Rob Van Dam had to defend both the WWE and ECW titles on two separate nights. RVD losing the WWE title to Edge on Raw, and eventually losing the ECW title to The Big Show. So Rob Van Dam had to get phased out of TV for about a month, and I believe that's the same time as Kurt Angle. So definitely July was overall just a very ugly period for WWE, or I guess you could say like ugly month for WWE at that time. Just a lot of suspensions, injuries, just, I don't know, it was just a lot of crazy stuff that was going on, to put it at best. But rambling aside, I just want to kind of get down to the bottom of this purpose of this video to continue what I've been doing since I started this installment. And we're going to continue here with Chapter 8, the Smackdown July pay-per-view, Great American Bash. What I would do is open up with a cruiserweight title belt up for grabs. Chavo Guerrero, he's going in as a champion, taking on Jimmy Wang Yang. Now, Jimmy Yang was already returning to WWE if he hadn't been returning already. I looked it up just to see if he was on the roster because it said I believe he was doing some tryout matches before they ended up debuting him in the fall of that year. And you may say this might be against the spirit of things, but I wasn't sure officially when he signed with the contract. I would like to think that he was already negotiating some deal with WWE, which he eventually took. And Jimmy Yang, I would actually debut him with the gimmick that he ended up debuting during this time. That actually got really, really over. So I really want to kind of spice up the cruiserweight division, especially with how I just want to try to get the cruiserweight division going by adding someone into that division. Jimmy Yang making his return to the WWE, especially with this iteration of his character. I would have him win matches on SmackDown to kind of get an idea, just kind of build some momentum heading into this match. I would do some vignettes as well, like they did, just to kind of get a basic introduction of what his character is supposed to be about. And I would have Jimmy Yang win. I would have him win in his, I want to say, like I said, return match. And to really kind of get the Great American Bash really kicking off by having a championship match with a new champion walking out, that being Jimmy Wang Yang. Second match I would have is Mr. Kennedy taking on Tatanka. Now, Mr. Kennedy had already returned after an injury that sidelined him throughout the first half of 2006. He was already making his return on SmackDown, and he's kind of going through a win streak. And Tatanka would be the enhancement talent, that kind of a veteran that was on the SmackDown roster at this time. Now, I had Mr. Kennedy paired up with The Miz. Now, I was kind of fluctuating back and forth whether or not I want to have Kennedy and Miz to kind of have some alliance going on within the two. Now, I do realize that Mr. Kennedy has something about his character that really kind of felt like he could stand out on his own, especially with his unique microphone that would come from the rafters, like when you see in the boxing fight, and Mr. Kennedy would like raise his arms up and then watch as the microphone just descends from the rafters. Now, I wanted to have him pair up with The Miz just to kind of really blend in their brash and arrogance in terms of their personalities, which I think on paper, I think it could really gel well. And they were on the same roster, and I want to kind of utilize The Miz in some form, just to kind of really put those two wrestlers over. I would have Mr. Kennedy go over to Tonka here, just this typical short TV style undercard match, and try to get Kennedy over here. My third match is going to be the FBI taking on Matt Hardy and Shane Helms. Now, if you watch from my previous video, there was a trade in which Johnny Nitro, along with his valet Melina, would get traded over from SmackDown to Raw, where SmackDown in exchange gets, like I said, Shane Helms and Ashley Mazzaro. Now, the FBI, especially with Nunzio and Vito, basically they've been kind of trying to build up themselves after they lost the match, and then Tony Mamaluke makes a surprising appearance. Basically, he's kind of going... It's a similar situation in which Bret Hart interrupted the match between Owen and British Bulldog. Basically, a bit of dissension going on between Nunzio and Big Vito. And Tony Mamaluke is kind of there to kind of bring the family closer together. And they lost the match to London and Kendrick, a tag title match. And Tony Mamaluke is just very disappointed just to see Nunzio and Vito just completely taking out their frustrations on one another. And for Tony Mamaluke, it just makes him sick to his stomach. Now, this eventually leads to a reunion of the FBI. And since they were doing the whole ECW revival, they were already bringing in wrestlers that were part of the original ECW. One of them being Tony Mamaluke, and as well as Big Guido. Big Guido was coming in. The FBI tried to bring the mafia back together, as Tony Mamaluke would say in a promo. And they've been kind of going through a tear backstage, just beating up all these jobbers, and one of them being Road Warrior Animal, who would end up getting released by the company at this time. Matt Hardy eventually has a match with one of the members of the FBI, but that ends in a DQ when the entire full-blooded Italians just goes on a 4-on-1 assault on Matt Hardy. That is until Shane Helms comes out. He has a steel chair. The FBI end up retreating while Shane Helms comes in supposedly to save his best friend Matt Hardy. So we bring up their friendship that will kind of play a somewhat of a part into this tag team match. And Matt Hardy is kind of reluctant, especially with given the reputation that Shane Helms has had since the past several months since he turned on Rosie. So Matt Hardy is kind of on the fence when it comes to Shane Helms and his attitude, and just something about him that just really makes him sick to his stomach. But with the benefit of the doubt, Matt Hardy, has to go with it. He knows that the odds are stacked against him. Shane Helms is like, you need a friend. I know I've done some questionable things that I've been doing for the past several months, but I just hope that this doesn't affect our long-time friendship that we have with each other. Something to that effect. And so we have the match. The FBI is going to go over Matt Hardy and Shane the Hurricane Helms. And the FBI is going to win this match by pinning Matt Hardy, who's the legal man that gets pinned, in order to win the match. Fourth match we have is the United States Championship. Rey Mysterio defending the belt against Finlay, along with the special guest enforcer Arn Anderson. Now, back at Judgment Day, Finlay had successfully defeated Chris Benoit, but more than just defeating Benoit, he ends up decimating him by using the shillelagh weapon that he was using, sidelining Chris Benoit out of action. Now, Arn Anderson, as far as his role is concerned, because Arn Anderson, he was one of the founders of the Four Horsemen. He has history with Chris Benoit. He was one of the guys that really supported him during his time, eventually recruiting him as the Four Horsemen. Especially bring Arn Anderson in for a wrestler that was a part of the NWA's heyday, especially with the Great American Bash being a vestige of NWA old school WCW wrestling tradition. I figured bringing in Arn Anderson to kind of make sure that neither competitor tries to find a way to resort to using underhanded tactics of such, especially with Finlay and his signature shillelagh that he would use during desperate situations. And I would have him as a guest enforcer just to kind of mediate the two competitors with Rey Mysterio and Finlay to kind of really make sure that this match is a clean match that you could possibly have. Even though Finlay is going to get a lot of offense in this match, Rey Mysterio, playing the underdog, is going to go over Finlay. A hard-fought bout where it may seem that Mysterio might lose the match, but luckily Rey Mysterio manages to overcome some odds and eventually defeating Finlay to retain the US title there. Tag Team Championship belts up on the line. The Hooligans defending the belts against the Pitbulls. For those that don't know, the Pitbulls, that was Jamie Noble and Kid Cash. There was a match that they did at the actual Great American Bash, so I thought I'd keep it on here. I thought that was actually a pretty solid, very solid match, even though it was an opener in the real Great American Bash 2006. But yeah, this was actually a really fun match. There wasn't really a whole lot of depth to the tag team division, but this is kind of the result that was laid upon. So, London and Kendrick get them something to do, try to find some competition by defending those tag title belts, and they would go over the Pitbulls in a pretty solid match like it was. Now we get to the first out of the two doubleheader main events, and this particular match involves the rivalry between Dave Batista and Randy Orton, two former Evolution teammates as well as former World Heavyweight Champions at this point in their careers. Batista and Orton ended up getting drafted over to SmackDown. Batista coming in as the World Heavyweight Champion. He successfully defended that title belt throughout the rest of 2005. But unfortunately, a tricep injury ends up playing a big factor as to having Batista get sidelined out of action for the first half of 2006. Batista vacates the World Heavyweight title as SmackDown has a battle royal to determine who would be the World Heavyweight Champion. Randy Orton successfully wins that vacated title belt. He successfully defends that belt all the way to WrestleMania 22, where he loses the belt to Kurt Angle. Now, Kurt Angle, in a worked injury angle, ends up breaking Orton's ankle with the ankle lock, sidelining Orton out of action. Now, fast forward in July, Batista makes his anticipated comeback thanks to a large part of these vignettes, which hype up his televised return. Batista comes back the first SmackDown in July, basically providing updates on what he's been doing the past several months, what he had been going through, the process when he was undergoing surgery. But now all that matters is that Batista's back and he's hungry for a fight. So he demands Mark Henry to get his ass out of the locker room, into the ring. Let's have this fight right here, right now. So Mark Henry ends up coming out. He explains why he did what he did to Batista, before Mark eventually tells him that he'd been hired by someone else to injure Batista, which kind of confuses him. It's like who exactly would even think of an idea to pay someone to injure Batista? Now, before he could lay a hand on Mark Henry, Teddy Long, the SmackDown general manager, chimes in to address the situation. As hungry as the animal is for retribution, Batista doesn't want to wait until the Great American Bash to get his hands on Mark Henry. To kind of solve this whole issue, Teddy sanctions a no-holds-barred match between Batista and Mark Henry at Saturday night's main event, with Batista going over in the process. Now, during the aftermath, Batista asked Mark who was responsible for hiring Mark Henry to even take him out in the first place. Now, suddenly, a man dressed in the mask ambushes Batista from behind and lays him out with the RKO. Person removes his mask, reveals Randy Orton, where the announcers just put it over. It's like, we haven't seen this guy since WrestleMania 22. Now, according to Randy Orton, the following week on SmackDown, the go-home show to the Great American Bash, Orton explains that he's been sick and tired of waiting for his title opportunity to come to him. Randy Orton had mentioned how last year, towards the end of December, when Teddy Long and Randy Orton were engaged in this conversation, Orton just complaining about why he hasn't gotten a title match against Batista. But since Randy Orton has grown a lot more impatient throughout the weeks, Teddy Long, even gets to the point where he warns Randy Orton that if he even lays a hand on Batista, then Orton would not get a shot at the world title as long as Batista remains champion. Orton reveals that he was responsible for paying Mark Henry to take out the trash, and thus giving Orton a chance to take advantage of that opportunity and get a hold of the World Heavyweight title. Now, knowing Batista and finding out the answers as to why Orton did what he did, he eventually looks to retaliate and will stop at nothing to destroy or to get his hands on his former Evolution comrade, Batista, giving him his first match since coming back from his injury. Randy Orton, this is also his pay-per-view return as well, at least in this scenario. Now, as you notice, I did not trade Randy Orton over to Raw. Now, I understand that they did that because Raw was kind of in dire need of key important villains into their roster. I mean, they had Triple H turn face. They brought Johnny Nitro over to Raw, but he was, even though he was a mid card, so he was an up and comer though. I think that could explain why Orton ended up going over to Raw, just to kind of balance out the roster there. But even given with ECW at this time taking a lot of their top superstars, especially with Kurt Angle, who was on SmackDown and then subsequently went over to ECW like in reality. But I really do think that SmackDown was in dire need of star power. And I think they needed someone like Randy Orton to kind of keep the glue stuck together, if that makes any sense. But, with Batista, I want to give him something to do, but also give Randy Orton something to do as well. Orton was pretty much floundering throughout the summer and early autumn of 2006. So I wanted to kind of put him in a high-profile feud, even though he's not necessarily contending for the World Heavyweight title at this moment. But this would be the second big feud to come out of SmackDown. And I want to present this in a way where it wouldn't necessarily damage either wrestler in terms of their credibility. So what I would do here is to have the match end in a double countout. Batista and Orton would be brawling all over at ringside and throughout the arena, maybe even the crowds. You have referees and security officers coming out there to do their best to restrain both competitors, but even despite that, Batista and Orton are still going at it. It's like a slugfest. Announcers try to put it over. It's like these two guys are just ripping each other apart. Two former friends, just now bitter enemies. Something to that effect. There's going to be a lot more to come between Batista and Orton. Now we get to the main event for the World Heavyweight title. We have Booker T going in as the champion, defending the belt against The Undertaker. Now originally I had Booker T going in as the number one contender, challenging Kurt Angle for the world title after winning the King of the Ring at Judgment Day. But after the circumstances surrounding Kurt Angle and ended up being suspended for about a month, I think it's somewhere like 30 to 60 days, like I mentioned earlier in the video. But even if I wasn't able to avoid that incident, what I would do here is that Kurt Angle would have the match against Booker T on SmackDown. Basically, Teddy Long, being the general manager that he is, trying to do his best to be as impartial as he possibly can. What would happen is that Teddy Long would urge Kurt Angle to defend the belt against Booker T on SmackDown after what had just happened the week prior, where Kurt Angle ended up physically assaulting Sharmell, locking in that ankle lock, getting to the point where Sharmell the following week would be appearing with these crutches. Now, because of all of this, basically Teddy Long has to force Kurt Angle to defend the belt against Booker. This is kind of punishment for Kurt Angle after what he did to Booker's wife Sharmell. So basically, Kurt has to pay for what he did, and this would be a match on SmackDown, which Booker T would end up going over and becoming the World Heavyweight Champion. Now, The Undertaker gets kind of put into this position during a celebration in which The Undertaker interrupts Booker T. Booker T just talking about how he worked so hard in earning a title opportunity, and he finally proved the naysayers wrong. It's like it's been years and years since he's held the big gold belt. It's like 9 times out of 10, whenever he was going after the belt, he would always come up short. But after all the struggles that he had to go through, Booker T, like I said, proved those naysayers wrong and eventually became the World Heavyweight Champion. So all that's going on. The Undertaker's music hits, the lights go out, smokes come ascending from the stage. Undertaker just basically comes out, cuts a short promo, just basically talking about how, that he earned Kurt Angle's trust, that he respected Kurt Angle. Undertaker having that match from Judgment Day, that he grew a lot of respect from Kurt Angle. A match is set for the bash between Booker and Undertaker, and Booker T is going to go over the dead man, even though this match would involve some outside interference from Finlay and William Regal. Now, this isn't necessarily King Booker's court, even though it's sort of a template as far as the alliance is concerned, because they did have a faction where Booker was in cahoots with Finlay and Regal. But because in this case where Booker T isn't necessarily King Booker in this scenario, so it would be an entirely different concept of a stable that they would have. And Booker T is going to come out of the Great American Bash still your World Heavyweight Champion. And that's basically the Great American Bash card that I've booked in general. So let me know what you thought about this card down the comment section below. This card, for a show in July, a lot of it had to do with a lot of bad timing in terms of some of the bait and switch that WWE had done throughout this card. And it was just a very crazy month for WWE in 2006 with all the elevated liver enzymes and these wellness suspensions that was going on. It was just a lot of bait and switch, like I said, that was just completely affecting WWE's booking and direction that they were going. But I hope that this card on paper is at least something that is tolerable, something that some viewers might not seem to mind going out their way to purchase this show. It's a card consisting of 7 matches. Let me know what you thought about this card in general. So feel free to, like I said, comment down in the comment section below. Tell me what your thoughts. Stay tuned as I will book the 9th chapter in my Wrestling Reimagining series, as I will continue to book WWE 2006 with the August pay-per-view SummerSlam. Stick around for that if you're still interested. And till then, thank you all guys for watching. This is the Gold Standard 0924 signing out.